The DSM manual got mentioned a couple of times over the last day and a half, but this is it's going to have a starring role here. And what I want to do is give you a tour of the DSM with really reviewing the diagnoses related to sexuality. And as the title implies, I think a way of looking at the evolution is originally focused on deviance as being in the object of one's sexual behavior and choice, and now it's more an issue of diagnosis of identity and particularly gender dysphoria. So I want to also point out, as you were saying, diagnoses used to be perceived in a very negative way, that there was a negative label, and the early gay movement really spent a lot of its energy trying to get it out of the first DSM. Whereas now, it's seen as a benefit in the sense it gives you access to treatment covered by insurance, and in this case, very specialized treatment. And I think it's part of a general shift in which people are not so against labels. And you see it like in education, where this label of autism gives your child access to early childhood programs. In the VA system, the diagnosis of PTSD gives you access to benefits and treatment. And so the other thing I want to point out is I think there's a group fantasy in this culture about gender fluidity, and it's not just a matter of the gender dysphoria, but there's a general discomfort with rigid labels of gender. So the DSM series began in 1952. The most recent one, DSM-5, was in 2013. I want to point out a couple things. It is a diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders published by the IPA. Now the S in all of the DSMs is statistical. And you mentioned, I mean, statistical in this sense really meant that they focused on reliability, which is to say they would like a category in which two mental health professionals can sit down with the same person and come up with the same diagnosis, as opposed to reliability, that it actually means it. But they're always criticized on that basis that these diagnoses don't make sense. But really, the APA always has in mind somebody sitting down with an hour to make this determination, and having 8 people ahead of them and so forth. So it's really reliability and ease of making a diagnosis, and even at that they fail. I mean, they do field trials before each of these, and they often really don't get very good reliability. It is published by the American Psychiatric Association. The American Psychiatric Press makes a lot of money for the APA, and even though it's really not just a matter of the manuals themselves, but each edition comes with a whole periphery of other volumes on how to do an interview, to make a diagnosis, decision trees in making the diagnosis. So, 1952, the first DSM. I understand that this is not very legible. Just to point out how these things were categorized, there's a psychophysiologic, autonomic, and visceral disorders. And these are divided by organ systems. So one that has a couple sexual-related diagnoses, or the GU system. You can see that this was a very psychoanalytically infused set of diagnoses with a lot of neuroses. Then there's personality disorders. Under personality disorders is antisocial, and under that is sexual deviance. So really, it's a very adverse diagnosis. We go back here because the other area is transient situational diagnoses, personality disorders. The idea here was that these were divided up by age. And it was felt that it was not appropriate to give an adult-type diagnosis to a child or an adolescent, particularly for adolescents who are felt to be so emotionally labile, so inconsistent in their behavior and thinking that they could appear almost psychotic one day, but that was just part of their development. It was an injustice to label them as having a psychiatric diagnosis. So that went rather quickly, but that was the thinking in those days. So under the GU, psychophysiologic reactions, is menstrual disorders and dysuria and so forth. And there's a lot of so forths in these early editions, a lot of things in which people could fit various behaviors without the manual itself really specifying them all. This was felt, they gave some attention to distinguishing this from psychosomatic, in that it felt that psychosomatic was really a way of thinking about the relationship between the body and the psyche, whereas these were meant to be much more specific diagnoses. These disappeared rather quickly, but they're frequently used back in those days. So it says menstrual disorders, dysuria, and so forth. There's sociopathic personality disorders, under that, sexual deviation, and within that category, a wide range of things from homosexuality to fetishism to rape. And so you can see that carrying that diagnosis was not felt to be any benefit whatsoever. It was a very harsh, very negative view of homosexuality that was depicted in the diagnostic system. And you can see that would lead to a movement to get some of these diagnoses removed. Among the diagnoses of the adjustment reactions are habit disturbance, and it lumps nail biting, masturbation, and tantrums with etc. Conduct disturbance lumps truancy and sexual offenses, among other things, and etc. So DSM-2 is very much a continuation of the first. It came out in 1968, had the same basic psychoanalytic framework. The sexual deviation was still under personality disorder and certain other non-psychiatric mental disorders, but it wasn't under antisocial personality. So in 1973, the American Psychiatric Association voted, but only by 50%, in favor of accepting a report that had been by a task force that had been put together to address the question as whether homosexuality should remain a diagnosis. So the APA vote was, strictly speaking, to accept the committee report as opposed to whether or not homosexuality was a diagnosis. So then, as of the sixth printing in October of 1973, it was removed.
What does dysphoria mean? Dysphoria?
Painful sexual intercourse with a female.
Yeah.
So that category got expanded a bit. So this is the second printing of DSM-2. You can see it has a fairly similar list to the first, with homosexuality at the top. But this is the 12th printing in October of 1979. But I'm pretty sure it was the sixth printing in October of 1968. Or in 1973, where these changes were made. And you can see that they say that homosexuality in itself should not be a diagnosis, except when the person is not happy with being homosexual. So the idea that there was a treatment to sort of cure one of being homosexual was very popular in those days, and it was offered. It was both within a psychoanalytic framework and others. But they did mostly in reaction to political pressure from the gay liberation movement, remove the diagnosis. But there wasn't in any way 100% acceptance of this within the psychiatric community. DSM-3, moving on, was 1980, and it was a rather complete departure from the first two. It really rejected the psychoanalytic framework. Neuroses were no longer in a diagnostic category. And its argument was that the psychoanalytic, psychodynamic point of view implied causality, that most psychiatric problems were due to manifestations of internal conflict going back to childhood, presumably. Whereas they emphasized more diagnostic criteria. Any diagnosis had several things you had to check off. They added some extra axes. So there's the first axis with the main diagnosis, and axis 2 for personality disorders and for certain cognitive things like learning disabilities. Psychosexual disorders have their own category now. They're not under personality disorders. And this new gender identity disorder comes about. And then what used to be sexual deviance is now paraphilias. And within that, there's a lot of stuff about sexual functioning. Sort of the idea that, there's a normal amount of arousal or sexual interest or performance, experience of orgasms, and so there's kind of a standard, and if you fall short of that, you qualify for this diagnosis. And there's still this ego-dystonic homosexuality. If you are homosexual and don't like it, then we have a treatment for you. But we will leave you alone, just based on being homosexual. This is the diagnostic criteria for gender identity. I think back in those days it was understood more as say, an adolescent who was sort of confused and unsure about their sexual identity. But if you read their criteria, it's really gender dysphoria, somebody that just does not believe themselves to be the sex that they were assigned at birth, doesn't want to be the sex they were assigned at birth. And it's divided up into criteria for males and females. DSM-5 in 2013.
Can I interrupt one quick question?
Sure.
What did they do with intersexuality back then?
It's addressed in DSM-5. I'm not sure what they said back then, but that was considered. When you're talking about people who are actually born with ambiguous genitalia or have, testicular feminization and so forth. That, I'm not sure was addressed earlier in DSM-5. So it has a much expanded view of sexual dysfunction. And like I say, there was a sense of you're comparing yourself to what you should be in terms of your interest in sex, the ease with which you become aroused in sexual activity, the ease in which you have orgasm. And so there's categories for failing to achieve all of them. And there's much more of an emphasis on that sort of subjective experience of sexual activity and away from some of the deviations. So female orgasmic disorder. Within the gender dysphoria, these are divided by children and adolescents or adults. And it's not divided so much by male, female like the previous one. And see, this is specify if with a disorder of sex development. That's where that intersex category. It's still the other gender dysphoria, but it's if you that allows for the categories of people who have a biologic mixed sexuality, ambiguous sexuality. These are the now called paraphilic disorders. There's been some additions such as fracturistic disorder.
Say that again.
What?
Please say that again, that word.
Fracturism. it's rubbing against,
up
yeah. Against the, the phenomenon of the subway.
Photos. Yeah. Okay.
And some of these diagnoses have remained remarkably consistent, particularly the paraphilic ones. Fetishism has remained more or less unchanged through this, so that there is some tendency to still pathologize certain sexual objects as an interest of the person. Long set of category for criteria for gender dysphoria, but divided not so much male, female, but by adolescent and adult as opposed to children. Here are some more specifiers. Okay, so we have a diagnosis that appeared at least in 1980 has been elaborated on and expanded, more criteria, and so we have treatments for it. And around the country, mostly associated with major medical centers and universities, there are child and adolescent gender clinics. And you can see that these are not your typical mental health clinic. The director is a pediatric endocrinologist, there's an education specialist, a developmental specialist, a social worker. So, but the idea is that these are clinics that have the personnel to help somebody with gender dysphoria come in and presumably say a child, pre-adolescent child, to help through individual therapy to clarify that diagnosis and that the strength of that new gender identity. To the next thing that comes up is whether you should suppress puberty that they would naturally have given their biologic gender, and eventually sexual surgery, if. So these clinics are kind of one-stop shopping, and they also help the person to, deal with the schools, and there's a school specialist who might help the school directly deal with the child and help the family understand this. So this is a typical case history. Monique is an African-American 16-year-old. She's referred to a community mental health center. She is in foster care, so there's some other things going on. The therapist discovers that gender worries at the core of her psychiatric distress, and so she's referred to one of these clinics. And I think she gains access to a clinician who can better understand her core gender issues in the context of her other psychological symptoms. And I think that's what the goal of these clinics are. So this was this was something like a focus group at the program, I think it was up in Yale, and they sat a number of people, I assume mostly teenagers in one of these gender clinics, and asked them what they would like people, in this case specifically their doctors, to know about them. And so one statement is something you increasingly hear, is that non-binary people exist. There's just this rejection of the idea that you have to be either male or female. And another is if I'm depressed, it's likely not because I have issues with my gender identity, but because everybody else is. And I mean, these clinics pretty much accept that. There's not an effort to talk somebody out of their sexual identity, but to help them navigate this new identity within the family, within the school, and the community, and to take steps down the road, if they wish to physically become the new gender. But think how different that is from, say, the 1950s. You can imagine a gay person in that era saying, I have no problem being gay. It's everybody else that has a problem. But the diagnostic system and culture in general just didn't accept that. And so if there was treatment available, it's if you wanted to not be gay. Whereas the treatment in these clinics is not focused on that at all. It's focused on helping people clarify and if they wish to become their new gender. And there's research coming out of these clinics that, this is from Seattle, I believe, and it's to the effect that if you help a group gender dysphoric pre-adolescents basically transition into their new role in terms of dress and pronouns and behavior and so forth, that they have less anxiety and depression than a control group. This isn't a longitudinal study, and there's not a control group of people that were around, helped to transition. And sorry if that's not readable, but so there is research coming out of these clinics that is helpful to this group of teens and preteens. So like I say, I think there's a larger issue here, and there have been a number of national magazines that have covered articles on gender. There's just kind of a fascination with this phenomenon, with the whole idea that there's a spectrum of gender and choose your own, and that it is definitely not he or she. This concept of non-binary is something I hear a lot from the kids that I see. This is part of the application process to a dating service, OkCupid, and I don't know if you can read that very well, but there are 12 categories of sexual interest or sexual identity, and you can pick 5 of them. So the whole idea of choose your own gender is very common, and I think it's kind of beyond this core issue of gender dysphoria. I think that people are really aware of the downside to traditional male and female roles, that to be a real man is to be aggressive, prone to accidents, doing a lot of risk-taking behavior, drinking and drug use and domestic violence. And to be a real woman is something that feminism has rejected long ago. So just to put this as a group fantasy, here's a cover from National Geographic a few issues after the first one. I think you'd have to say, and this has nothing to do with gender, this is sort of the next step in human evolution. And I think you'd have to say that the next step is a sexually ambiguous person, androgynous, very young looking, and without many features of aging compared to the previous one. So let me say the group fantasy is that humanity is going to be genderless, eternally youthful, and robotic.
What do you mean by that?
So,
Do you mind going back to that chart? Because there's some of those terms that are new to me. I don't know if you have time to go through some of them.
well, straight,
Got
gay.
that one. What's demisexual?
Demisexual, as I understand it, and it took a granddaughter to explain this to me, is basically minimally interested in sex. Being in a relationship or in a situation where you look at somebody and would say, I think I really should be attracted to that person. And, you know, it's not like I'm not attracted, but I'm not interested in sex with them. It's, you know, sort of like a demi-tasse. A small amount of libido, something along those lines.
That's good.
And
How about,
But that was
how about
considered not
sapiosexual?
okay.
that's somebody who's attracted to intelligence.
Sapiosexual is?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, this is a dating service, and so
Yeah.
you're setting up a profile, and if you like really intelligent, well-educated persons, you can have them of whatever sex you want, because you can pick 5 categories here. You know, I don't mean to make light of this. I mean, this is a major issue, and I think compared to our generation, it seems like an awful lot of work figuring out who you are and where you are and who you want and how to get them and so forth. But it's
Oh.